To finish out the rest of this project, it's going to be up to you to add more lifelike movement to the rest of your character's face. In addition to the movement of the mouth along with the audio track, we should also see him blinking. We should see him looking to the left and the right, up and down, moving his eyebrows, hair, nose, ears, everything about him appropriately. Now, this doesn't have to be random movements. As you listen to the audio, imagine yourself speaking the words. Now, because every person's design and audio is going to be different, there's no way I can tell you every problem you're going to face. Hopefully by now you have a good understanding of how to animate a subject and tackle any problems that tend to come up. But in this video, I will cover some of the main problems you'll need to tackle. One of the first things you'll need to do is to establish a mouth that can be moved from side to side, and also establish your eyes so that they can blink. So to get started, let's select our head and double click on it to go into its isolation mode. We've already set up the mouth with the timeline that's got all of the different keyframes that follow along with your audio layer. However, as your face moves from one side to the other or up and down, you want to be able to move all of these keyframes along with it. And we can't simply do that in one particular setting the way it's set up now. So what we want to do is we want to copy this mouth layer into a separate symbol and replace it for what we have here. So to do this, I'm going to select the entire layer by clicking on it, and we'll go up to Cut the Layer. Then let's go over to our Library panel and create a new symbol at the very bottom, and we'll call this our new mouth. Do make sure that it's a graphic. We'll say OK. And inside of this layer, we'll go down to our timeline, right click on it, and choose Paste Layers. This will give us our mouth layer inside of here. With that done, you can see we now have a new mouth inside of our library panel. Now let's go back to our full head that we created by double clicking on that symbol. There we go. And let's add the mouth back onto it. First, let's go to our timeline and create a new layer, and we'll simply call this mouth again. Now with this mouth layer selected and the first frame selected, we'll go back over to our library panel and find your new mouth and drag it onto here. Now we have this single mouth frame set as one symbol that can be moved along with your head should you need to be able to move it whenever possible. With this done, we also need to add some time to any of your symbols that have sub-layers. For instance, the eyes that we created, they have both a pupil and a white, and they have their own timeline inside of them. That timeline for these symbols needs to match the same amount of time that you have for the overall head and for your overall scene 1. So let's take it one thing at a time too. I'm going to select the right eye here and double click on it. Notice that there's only one frame in there so far, so we need to add more time to this. All you have to do is scroll over on your timeline as far as you can, and you may have to do this a couple of times. Select those last keyframes and hit F5. Notice this only sent me over to frame or second 24. So I'm going to scroll over again. And I need to have at least 69 seconds. So select a few. This is as far as it'll let me go now. Hit F5. Scroll over again. And we're reaching the end to there's 68, there's 69. As long as it has at least the same amount, then you're okay. If you have more, then that's okay too, because we're going to trim off the excess once we're finished. So I did that for my right eye. Let's go back to our main head. We'll select the left eye. Left eye has the same thing. It needs to have time added to its timeline. So going down to the very end, scroll as far as you can over and hit F5 for both the layers. Then scroll again and hit F5 until you get the amount of time that you need for your, there's 69 for me, that you need for your audio that you have. Also repeat this process for anything else that has a sub-layer inside of it that needs some extra time for its movement. Now with that done, we can return back to scene 1. And I'm going to go through and I'm going to rough out the position I want his facial features to be in as he's speaking. Now before I begin, one other thing we'll need to set. Go to your audio layer and select the first keyframe. If you go to your properties panel, right now I've got my audio sound on that layer to be synced with the event. Now when it's set to event, that only triggers the audio whenever it hits that first keyframe. This means if I was to move my keyframe over or my playhead over and play from here, it's not going to give me any audio. So if you're running into this problem, let's go back to our original keyframe, first one. Under your sound layer, change it from event to stream. Stream will allow it to keep playing wherever you're at. And therefore you should be able to see and hear the sound as you're playing through. Now I'm going to go through and I'm going to position the head and all the features of the head as he's moving and speaking. Alright, with this done, you can see on my timeline I've established some simple little head movements along with some pauses in between. And each of these head movements kind of accents and follows along with the movement and the emphasis of the audio that he's saying. So it adds a little bit more interest as he's speaking.
By Gerard Manley Hopkins. The world is...
They don't have to be anything dramatic, so very subtle little head movements. Of course, it depends on the style of your character that you have. But for him, he simply needs to have his head move slightly back and forth. The next thing I can do is to go into my head character and start animating the individual parts. Now to do this, I'm going to zoom back in on my timeline so I can see my individual keyframes wherever they're at. And I want to take this one movement at a time. So as he's tilting his head, maybe his eyebrows are raising up and down, or he's looking left and right as necessary. So going on our timeline, since this is a head tilt that starts on this side, maybe I'm going to have him looking off to the left-hand side. So with that keyframe selected, I can double click on my head structure to go into the isolated head. And the first thing I need to do is to create a series of keyframes on all the different layers that I have. So as soon as I enter, click and drag down on all the layers, then hit F6. And I like to do this regardless if I'm moving something or not. This just gives me an idea of the movement, or to know that I can create a movement without accidentally forgetting to add the keyframe. Now, one thing I don't want to tackle at this time is any eye blinking. Don't worry about that. We're going to save that to the very end because we're going to do something special with it. With these first keyframes established, I can go back to scene 1. And let's do the final keyframe. In my case, it's on frame number 38. So with it selected, we'll double click. And along these timelines, let's establish a keyframe for all the layers as well, hitting F6 to insert it there. Now I can go through each individual part from the start to the ending position and have it change up as necessary. So let's take it one thing at a time. Right now I've got my mouth layer selected, so with my selection tool I'm going to use my arrow keys and just nudge it over maybe 1 or 2 little bits till it's over to the left hand side over here. We'll do the same thing to match up the nose, so I'll select the nose. Holding down shift and using my arrow keys, we'll nudge it over to match. Then I can hold down shift and select both of my eyes and nudge those over as well. And we can also do the same thing for the eyebrows. I'll nudge those over. Maybe I'll pull those down just a bit into place as well. So you can see how everything just moves over. Let's do the same thing for the hair. We'll nudge it over and maybe down just a bit into place. And for this top layer, since it's a shape layer, we can simply use our selection tool and move this into place. So since he's rotating his head slightly this way, we're going to see more of this side. So I'm going to bring it out and make the adjustment. Now on yours, if you had this as a sub layer, then you'll need to simply go into it and establish a timeline on its layer. Since it's rotating this way, we're going to see less of this part on this side. Now your hair may be slightly different than the setup of mine, so just take it one thing at a time. There we go. We'll set that up as well. The tricky part is going to be animating these ears as they rotate and go behind and in front of his head. I'll go ahead and select his rightmost ear, and since he's rotating this way, this ear is going to be pulled inward about that much, maybe not even that much. So I'll pull it in right about till there. So that's okay for this one. This ear, on the other hand, is going to be going the opposite direction. It's going to be pulled in towards this way. So I need to have it move inward like this. The problem is, you can see it's not going to be covering up his cheek. It's actually going to go behind this portion. The way we have our layers set up is we've got these ears on top of his face. We need to have a separate layer for the left and right ear that's below the face as well, so that we can turn on and off their visibility. Here's how we're going to do that. Go ahead and move your ears into position the way we've done it here. This way we can tell our starting and stopping point for our keyframes. But let's go down to our timeline and select both the left and right ear, right click on it, and let's do copy layers. This will make a copy of those. Then we can click below the face layer and then right click on it, and let's do paste layers. This will give us a copy of our left and right ear that's below it. And just for good measure, I'm going to rename it our left and right ear copy. And we'll do the same thing for this one too. So let's check out what we have. We now have a copy of our right and left ear both in front of and behind our face. Now, of course, we don't need to see both of these at the same time. Instead, we want to see whichever ears that are necessary. So on our timeline, leading up to this face turn, we really don't need to see our left and right ear copies that are behind the face. The ones in front of the face are okay. So I'm going to select these keyframes and simply delete them away. Once he starts to turn, however, we only need to see this leftmost ear disappear behind it. So at the start of this is where I'll go and select my left ear. And we can delete it away at this point. And so now you can see the ear that's behind it. The ear that's below the face is the one that we're going to animate. I can also delete it away at this keyframe too. Now when I go to animate it, all I need to do is animate that left ear that's behind it. This will make sense once we start adding in our motion tweens next. The next thing you may want to do is to add any motion to any sublayers, like on your eyes. If he's going to look off to this left-hand side, let's have his eyes move off to the right or to the left too. So again, we're working on that last keyframe. We'll double click on, in my case, this right eye, and immediately go to the timeline and hit F6 to add a keyframe for the ending position. And then you can go to the eye. Let's have it move off to the left this way. So there you can see it looking off to this way. Now that's the ending position. We need to back up a few frames. Remember, it starts on keyframe 35. And let's add a starting position for it. So this also moves from left to right. And before I forget, I'm just going to go ahead and insert my classic tween between both of those. This way it'll animate the eye as it's moving. Going back to our head keyframe, I know he looks a little wonky right now. Let's select that leftmost eye, double click on it, and do the same thing. In our timeline, immediately make a keyframe. And this time we'll nudge over this eye to match. Then in our timeline, we need to back up to keyframe 35, hit F6. And this will give us our starting keyframe. And then you can create your motion tween in between both of those. So now that eye will move along with it. So now you can see the starting and stopping point for each part of the head turn. From here, let's add our motion tweens. All we have to do is select our starting position and insert either a classic tween where is necessary. In my case, this part of the hair, see, we'll go up to the very top. Since this hair was a shape, I can't do a classic tween. I need to do a shape tween for it. There's the two between that. Everything else, I can select those keyframes, We'll select multiple, and I can do the classic tweens in between all of those. Create a classic tween, and then create classic tweens for this. Now you can see the head is rotating from the central point into this point. And I can adjust this as necessary. Let's return now to scene 1 and see what it looks like all together. We'll back up. So now not only is his head rotating to the side, but he's also looking to the side as well. And you could do this at any point. Now keep in mind, from this point forward, he's going to be looking in that direction. So if I need him to look back to the center, I need to animate him back to the center. You don't have to wait till the next head tilt. You can do this at any time, but this is going to be the basic process for setting up each individual part of his head movement. Listen carefully to your audio and get his head to react and act appropriately to what he should be saying. Let's do a full render and see what this sounds like and looks like as it plays through. So I'll go up to Control and Test.
God's Grandeur by Gerard Manley Hopkins.
So far that looked pretty good, but I think it needs to be a little bit slower on his head tilt and as he looks to the side. Now here's a common problem or trap that a lot of people will run into. If I go down to my timeline and I want that head tilt to last a little bit slower, in other words, I want it to take more time for him to tilt his head, I need to adjust both the timeline on my main timeline and also the timeline on the inside of my timeline or inside of my head's timeline. So let's do this first. We'll select this lastmost layer or lastmost keyframe 38. I'm just going to click on it and drag it over to here. We'll say I just did it arbitrarily 51, keyframe 51. Now of course this will let the tilt go a little bit slower, but you can see all the eyes and everything else inside of it is still taking those few keyframes. In other words, the time that it takes for him to tilt his head, you can see it's taking a lot longer than it does to rotate his head inside of there. That's what I mean to say. But we've also got another problem. If I select this keyframe, our starting keyframe at 35, and click on my head, let's go to the Properties panel. You can see that the first frame that's going to play is keyframe 35. However, if I click on my next keyframe, this is in this case keyframe 51, and I click on my head, check out what frame it's going to back up to. It's not frame 51, it's still on frame 38. This is because when we established this keyframe, it was originally on keyframe 38. Now if I go back and try to render this, it's going to give me an error and it's going to give me a problem with my playback. You can see this especially in the mouth movements and then later on the head movements. The reason I wanted to point this out, if you change up any of the established keyframes already on your timeline, make sure to go into the looping and change up the first keyframe that plays back. Since now I moved it to keyframe 51, I need to readjust this keyframe to frame 51 as well. This way all of the other sub keyframes will stay in sync with it. Let's do the same thing for the sub keys in this one. So double click on the head. You can see now that the movement's going to take a little bit less time. I can go in with all of these as well. I'm just going to hold down Shift and click on them. And I'm going to drag all of these over to frame number 51. So there it is established there. The thing about this is that if it's got a sublayer like on my eyes, I need this to also be moved over and to change its position too. So take this one thing at a time, because you can see as I select these keyframes, see, we'll do one for the eye. It's also off and I need to choose keyframe 51 too. So this is why it's important to get your timing right the first time rather than waiting for later on to go back and fix it. But you can go back and fix it if necessary. But that's just a common problem that I want to give enough time to look at and to be able to correct. So going through each one, we'll do the same for this one. Go down, select those keyframes. I want it to take longer. So So we'll pull it over to frame 51 there. And I can go into my eyes and let's make the adjustments for the eyes as well. So we'll double click those. Now these eyes don't have any sub keyframes, so I can actually pull that over there and I should be okay to go for it. Let's do the same for this eye. Double click on it, click and drag, and then double click. Now when I return to scene 1, you can see the whole thing will last the entire length of that rather than just moving quickly off to one side. So this is going to be your setup for the remainder of this project. Simply going through, listening to the audio, and then adjusting the head. Remember, we want to have him looking from the left and the right, have him look up and down and rotate his head whenever and wherever necessary. Also, as a second thing to think about, moving his eyes and eyebrows are the quickest and easiest ways of adding some good expression to whatever he's saying. So don't think that you have to move the entire head every time. Very often, just moving the eyes is plenty to do. In the next video, I'm going to have a majority of my head already animated through, and I'm going to show you how to add some blinking motion to his eyes. Then finally, I'll show you how you can export this as a video file.